Zevik yellowlight from the Latinite dina cast a desolate and eerie glow on the deserted highway. My shift was over, and I hurried home, a sense of unease weighing heavily on me. During the day, this road was picturesque, but at night, it transformed into a haunting nightmare. Suddenly, in the dim light of a streetlight, I saw a figure huddled, a woman standing, shivering. A light rain fell, plastering her hair to her pale face. A flicker of pity surged through me, and I pulled over to the side of the road. She rushed towards the car, her eyes filled with pleading. I hesitated, then reluctantly agreed to give her a ride. In the car, she remained silent, her dull eyes staring fixedly into the empty darkness. The silence was unsettling, but I tried to reassure myself that she was merely tired and afraid. At the gas station, I stopped to fill up the tank. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Maybe I should buy her something hot to eat? But when I turned back, the passenger seat was empty. I looked around in bewilderment, the gas station deserted. The woman had vanished like soap bubbles. A feeling of anxiety began to creep into my heart. Perhaps she had an urgent matter to attend to, or perhaps she simply didn't want to bother me. I tried to dismiss the wandering thoughts and continued driving home. My small apartment was on the ground floor of an old apartment building. The front door was usually unlocked. Only the apartment door required a key. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt a cold draft run down my spine. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The image of the woman haunted my mind. Strange sounds emanating from outside my bedroom added to my fear. Then the horrifying thing happened. In the dead of night, as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I suddenly woke up with a start. In the faint darkness, I saw a shadowy figure crouched in the corner of the room, behind the closet. My heart seemed to stop beating. I didn't dare scream, didn't dare move. The figure slowly stood up, stepped out of the corner, and disappeared. I lay motionless in bed until morning, when I finally dared to turn on the lights. The room was empty. But when I went to my car, the scene before me filled me with horror. The back seat was soaked, reeking of a metallic, sickening smell. The familiar blanket was gone without a trace. Terror engulfed me. I realized that the woman had sneaked into my car while I was filling up with gas. She had gained access to my apartment. She had taken the blanket. And I had narrowly escaped becoming a victim of something far more terrible. I quickly moved out, leaving behind the small apartment and the terrifying haunting. But the memory of that night, of the mysterious woman in the shadows, will forever remain a scar that cannot be erased from my mind. The dim lights of the bar faded behind her as she stumbled onto the familiar road. The thumping music and boisterous laughter gradually subsided into the frightening stillness of the suburbs. She had drunk too much. Everything was becoming blurry, indistinct. She remembered faces, fragmented stories, but they all slipped away like sand through her fingers. As her legs lost control, she suddenly snapped awake. The surrounding space was pitch black. She was lost. Towering trees stretched towards the night sky, forming bizarre, terrifying shapes. She tried to orient herself, but it was useless. Everything looked the same, a dark green labyrinth with no exit. Then she collapsed. When she awoke, the morning light was already peeking through. Her head throbbed, and her whole body ached. She was lying on the roadside grass, her white shirt smeared with mud. There wasn't a soul around, only the chirping of birds, as if mocking her. She stood up, staggering. A car stopped. A man, about 35 years old. Not handsome. Asinguati. Unreadable eis. He asked if she needed help. She nodded, rattling off the terrifying night, getting lost, losing her phone. She was too careless. He didn't say much, just nodded slightly and invited her into the car. The car sped off in silence. She felt uneasy. His voice was too soft, almost a whisper, creating a creepy feeling. He asked random questions, but his eyes were probing, as if weighing something. Time passed. The car continued on the desolate road. She started to worry. She asked him how much further it was to town. He was silent. She repeated the question. He only replied briefly, "Not far." But the car kept going, with no sign of a town. Fear surged. This wasn't the way to her house. Something was wrong. She felt danger lurking. Suddenly, he pulled the car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. He turned to look at her, his eyes full of threat. He started to move closer. She didn't have time to think. She opened the car door, jumped out, and ran. Ran as fast as she could into the deep forest. Luckily, the sneakers she was wearing made it easy to move on the rough terrain. She ran and ran, until she could no longer hear the sound of the car. Hiding behind a tree trunk, she held her breath, waiting, listening. Then she ran again, until she saw the faint headlights in the distance. She ran out onto the road, waving for help. Another car stopped. Another man, older. She sat in the back seat, trembling, not saying a word. The kind man took her home. That night, she couldn't sleep. Horrifying images haunted her. She vowed to never drink so much that she lost control again. She had been so lucky. But the obsession with the man in the car remained, like a scar that could not be erased. The music hammered against my ribcage, mixing with the erratic rhythm of my heartbeat. The alcohol soaked into every cell, blurring the line between reality and illusion. I knew I had drunk too much, but the loneliness and the yearning to fit in had pushed me to the verge of losing control. Where were my friends? I was lost in the noisy crowd, faces smudged in the flashing lights.
As the darkness swallowed everything, I realized I had been left behind. The familiar car vanished, taking with it both my sobriety and my means of returning. The endless road stretched before me, a dark path leading into the unknown. The cold of the October night seeped into my skin, making me shiver not just from the temperature.
A foolish idea popped into my head: hitchhiking. A gesture of supplication, a fragile hope in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. Cars sped past, leaving me stranded on the side of the road, despair rising like a tide. Finally, a pair of headlights flashed, a car stopping. A figure emerged, their face hidden in shadow. I climbed into the car, shedding the burden of loneliness and fear. But the safety was only a fleeting illusion. The road became unfamiliar, the turns unrecognizable. Unease began to gnaw at my mind, a sinister premonition creeping into every sense. The man drove in silence, a silence more terrifying than any words. His eyes were cold, piercing through the haze of intoxication, reaching my most primal fear. Then, the car turned onto a dirt road, leaving the streetlights behind. Trees reached out like ghostly arms, darkness engulfing us. I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Asiren violet, Tiering trug the silent night. Red and blue lights flashed, an unexpected salvation. He panicked, I ran. Footsteps pounded behind me, but I didn't dare turn my head. Finally, I fell into the arms of the police officer, recounting the story in a broken voice. He had vanished, the car vanished, leaving only me and the haunting terror. That night, I returned home, but I was never the same as I was yesterday. The darkness was still there, creeping into every dream, reminding me of the fragility of the line between safety and danger, between hope and despair.